the wealth of some nations. Section: Imperial Consumption. Economist Joan Robinson neatly summarized the link between colonialism and the development of capitalism in Europe and working-class consumption patterns. Beginning of long quote. It was not only superior productivity that caused capitalist wealth to grow. The whole world was ransacked for resources. The dominions overseas that European nations had been acquiring and fighting over since the 16th century, and others also, were now greatly developed to supply raw materials to industry. The industrial workers at home gained from imperialism in three ways. First of all, raw materials and foodstuffs were cheap relative to manufacturers, which maintained the purchasing power of their wages. Tea, for instance, from being a middle-class luxury, became an indispensable necessity for the English poor. Secondly, the great fortunes made in industry, commerce, and finance spilled over to the rest of the community in taxes and benefactions, while continuing investment kept the demand for labor rising with the population. Finally, lording it around the world as members of the master nations, they could feel their self-esteem upon notions of racial superiority. Thus, the industrial working class, while apparently struggling against the system, was in fact absorbed in it. End of long quote. The most important commercial crop at the beginning of the 19th century was sugar. Produced by slave labor, its sale generated enormous profits for sugar merchants, plantation owners, and investors. Sugar consumption in Britain doubled between 1690 and 1740. By the 1830s and the advent of industrialized textile production, however, its market value had been exceeded by cotton. Britain was unable to produce cotton and imported all of it from America, where it was produced by slaves, and from Egypt and India, where it was produced by subsistence peasants. Raw cotton, sugar, rum, and tobacco imports were shipped by the ton into prosperous British ports like Bristol, London, and Liverpool. All originated in the expanding slave plantations of America and the Caribbean. Many of Britain's primary products were producible exclusively in colonized tropical countries, though some were temperate food grains from colonies such as Ireland and India, as well as from the settler colonial United States. The most important items of direct mass consumption, for which there was substantial or complete import dependence, were wheat, of which India was probably the third most significant source, and wheaten flour, rice, cane sugar, beet sugar production in continental Europe being fairly insignificant, tea, coffee, and tobacco. Of these, only the first was produced in Britain, but production was not growing as fast as population between 1700 and 1850. At the height of the Industrial Revolution, during which time Britain was essentially self-sufficient in the temperate foodstuffs, grain, meat, and dairy products. By 1800, an estimated 18% of beef and pork consumption, 11% of butter and margarine consumption, and 12% of wheat and wheaten flour consumption in Britain was met by Irish imports alone. British importing of Irish grain, cattle, butter, and so on contributed to the hellish starvation in Ireland in the 1840s and 50s, from which Ireland's population levels have not yet recovered almost 2 centuries later. From the middle of the 19th century, a substantial general rise in incomes, particularly, as Davis notes, those of a large minority of the population, farmers, many kinds of skilled workers, the professional classes, and rentiers, led to a sudden leap in demand for semi-luxury food and drinks, and a sharp increase in the amount consumed per head. In this period, Britain shifted to, quote, the kind of import dependence in which starvation, rather than inconvenience or even poverty, became the alternative to importing. End quote from Davis. Whereas standard long-run real wage series simply divide the nominal wage by the price of an unchanging consumption basket, After Europe's, quote, discovery of America, its consumption habits were profoundly transformed and dramatically improved. Income gains from colonial goods such as tea, sugar, coffee added at least the equivalent of 16% and possibly as much as 20% of household income to British people's welfare by the middle of the 19th century. The intercontinental luxury trades of the early modern period transformed the European economy. Crucially, it was not only the consumption habits of Europe's elites that drove this transformation, but those of its working and middle classes. Beginning of long quote. Who was drinking all of this tea and coffee? Surely not just wealthy elites, as the volumes are too high to even entertain the possibility of limited social access to hot caffeinated beverages. Some of the import volume was, quote, lost to re-exports. But the ultimate consumers of these re-exports were, of course, just other Europeans, or their colonial counterparts. 18th century commentators of all national stripes did not hesitate to ascribe consumption of these caffeinated luxuries, usually as a complaint, to the teeming masses of their social inferiors. Probate inventory evidence on the social diffusion of the artifacts associated with this consumption has been accumulating over the past several decades, and it suggests that it was indeed widespread across the social landscape. End quote from Davis. The mass consumption of colonial consumer imports proceeded apace with the liberalization of trade, the incorporation of new producer countries in the international market, and the decline of prices, all predicated on the expansion of empire. McCants summarizes the main trends. Beginning of long quote. The consumption of tea, coffee, sugar, tobacco, porcelain, and silk and cotton textiles increased dramatically in Western Europe, beginning as early as the closing decades of the 17th century, only to accelerate through much of the 18th century. The consumer setbacks associated with the period of the French Revolution and a continent at war, especially as triggered by the Napoleonic blockades, should properly be seen as a severe interruption to the trend which would otherwise have extended rather more seamlessly from the early modern trade system to the, quote, transport revolution of the 19th century. Use of the new commodities brought by this trade spread rapidly, both in the geographical and social space. The presence of many of these so-called luxury goods is well documented down into the ranks of the working poor by the middle of the 18th century. There can be little doubt, then, that European demand was fueled not only by the rich with their growing, quote, surplus incomes, but by the much more numerous lower and middling classes of Europe's multitude of urban centers, followed by their rural counterparts. End of long quote from McCants. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, around 15 million slaves were exported by European merchants from Africa to the slave colonies on the opposite side of the Atlantic to produce many of these luxury items or their raw materials. As many as 1 in 5 slaves died during the journey, after enduring cramped, filthy, and dangerous conditions. Many more would die later on the plantations as a result of disease, overwork, and horrifying maltreatment. The expansion of the transatlantic slave trade can be located in the growth of profiteering fueled by popular consumer demand, behind which lay the sale into bondage of many millions of Africans. End of section.